My name is Tim Corey, and today I'm going to walk you through the basics of ASP.NET MVC. We're going to start off by identifying what we get right out of the box. After examining all the parts of MVC, along with how they fit together, I'll demo how to create a site, add pages, manipulate data, and more. By the time you're done this video, you should be able to create an ASP.NET MVC website on your own. Before we get started, I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, if you haven't already, click the subscribe button on this channel. But also, in the description, you're going to find a link to my mailing list. That's kind of important if you want to hear about exclusive opportunities, discounts on my courses, and a lot more stuff. And don't worry, I don't send out a ton of emails. But that's enough housekeeping for now. Let's jump right into MVC. Here I've got Visual Studio 2017 open. Now I'm using the Enterprise Edition, which has a few more bells and whistles, but the Community Edition is free. So if you don't already have 2017, I'd recommend downloading it. Just go to visualstudio.com. For those of you who can't use the latest version of Visual Studio because of business restrictions or other reasons, don't worry. What you have access to in Visual Studio 2015 should be about the same for MVC. You'll find a few differences, but don't worry about it. If you're on an earlier version of Visual Studio, you'll probably see more differences, but the core concepts should probably be the same. So let's start with a new project. And this is the first kind of hurdle with 2017 I want to talk about. And I've talked about it before, but the idea that I don't really like this search templates. It seems convenient, but really it's not. And the reason I say that is because these descriptions down here don't really give you the full story of which template you're choosing. And with the .NET Core and .NET Standard templates also having the same names as some of the ones we're currently used to using, that just makes things complicated. For example, if I were to search for ASP.NET MVC, I get 4 options. And they look the same. If you look to the right, 2 are C#, 2 are VB. If you mouse over, they actually look the same. So just don't mess with this, is my recommendation. It's just too easy to cause problems. Instead, go ahead, create new project, find it here. In this case, I'm in Web, so Templates, Visual C#, Web. In there you'll see ASP.NET Web Application .NET Framework, and let's expand that there. .NET Framework, not the .NET Core, and not .NET Core, even though it's .NET Framework. This first one right here, ASP.NET Web Application .NET Framework. That's the one you want. Now let's call this something we can understand. Let's start with MVC demo, no spaces. And for our solution, we'll call this our ASP demo application. So that the project name is MVC demo, the solution name is ASP demo application. Now this is the first thing you get. Now because my fonts are all bigger for display purposes for the video, this is a bit of a mess. Now Microsoft has said I submitted a ticket for this, and they have said that in an upcoming patch this will be fixed. But for right now, this is awful. But if you expand this out, you'll see that it actually fills in nicely. So, except for the OK and cancel. So we have a few options here. Now, by default, we've selected the MVC. We could do web forms, we could do empty, web API, and all the rest. But if you notice down below, there's some checkboxes here, and depending on what I select, it changes those checkboxes. So what this is doing is it's a series of templates, and depending on which options you select, it kind of puts things in or takes things out to create a template that's specific to what you want. In this case, we're looking for the MVC template. And we'll go over what MVC is in a minute. But for now, note that the web forms, That's kind of the old way of doing things. That's kind of the way that it's similar to WinForms in the desktop application side, as opposed to WPF. So this would be like the WinForms era websites. I would recommend if you're starting a new application that you not go that direction. There have been a lot of strides that have been made with web forms, but still they're kind of the old technology. I'd recommend against it. So we're going with the MVC instead. That's kind of the new way of doing a server-side website with C#. And we'll talk about server-side versus client-side in a little bit. But for now, this is the way we're going to go. Now, if you notice, this next thing, Web API, I love Web API. In fact, when I come into a company, that's the first thing I look for is, can we use Web API? Because what Web API allows you to do is kind of disconnect your user interface from your business logic and your data. And so I love that. And we'll cover that in a future video. But for now, we'll just note that it's here. And it's really a partner with MVC. Notice how these two are both checked when you select Web API. And these other ones down here we're not going to cover, but we'll get into those possibly in a future video. But for now, MVC. Now we could still select Web API with web forms or even add unit tests. Now, I've had a couple of questions about the fact that I don't do unit tests in certain videos. And that's true, I don't. I'm going to cover unit tests as on their own in a video upcoming, but I try and keep my videos very, very lean and clean. I try to fill them up with a whole bunch of different technologies all at once, where you have to learn 4 and 5 and 6 different things in order to get this one thing working. Instead, I try and teach you a piece at a time. And I find that's the best way, at least that I've seen, to learn, is to learn a piece at a time instead of trying to get overwhelmed with all this stuff. So we're not going to add unit tests now, but in a future video, we'll definitely come back and add unit tests to an MVC application to see how that'd work. Because it really is the same whether it's an MVC application or it's a desktop application or even just a class library. The other thing you're going to note is this change authentication button. This is pretty cool. It allows us to do different types of authentication, including Twitter authentication, Google authentication, Microsoft authentication, or Facebook, or our own app, our own authentication. So there's a lot of different options you could do with individual user accounts. It could also hook up to a Azure Active Directory, an Active Directory on site, or even Office 365. It could log in via your Windows credentials. So there's some fun things you can do there, some really powerful things, and really they make life easy as far as hooking these things up. For example, in individual user accounts, if you were to select this, the code is practically all there for hooking up to Facebook, Twitter, Google, or Microsoft. All you need to do is uncomment that section, put in your keys, and even tells you where to get those API keys for it, and then you're good to go, and it's ready for authentication. So you can have your application, and you can say only if you're authenticated or only if you're in a certain group, and all that fun stuff. But for today, we're going to say no authentication. So we're all set to go, but before I hit OK, I want you to keep your eye on this lower left-hand corner. I'm going to try and zoom in on it, but when I hit OK, there's going to be some activity down here. I want to see if you can kind of look at that and watch that, and we'll talk about what it's doing. So I hit OK, and right down here, there you go, adding Bootstrap, adding jQuery, and it's adding a whole bunch of different stuff. And so if you look at just the progress bar, which is up here right now, if you look at that, it seems like this loads slowly. But if you look in the lower left-hand corner, you see a lot of stuff happening. Now, some people kind of skip over that or miss that, but what that's doing is it's loading a whole bunch of different NuGet packages. And if you're not familiar with NuGet, NuGet is Microsoft's package manager. And what it allows us to do is take a bit of code and wrap it in a package and say, this code does this one thing. It may convert data to JSON. That's great. And so you have one package that does that. And for example, in this application, we have a NuGet package for jQuery. Well, jQuery is a JavaScript library. And what Microsoft has said is, instead of us reinventing the wheel and saying we're going to create our own JavaScript library for doing what jQuery does, we recognize that jQuery does things really well. And so we're going to bring them in as a package instead of us doing it ourselves. And so what this makes our MVC application be is a modular application. It's no longer Microsoft saying, here's all your stuff, use our stuff, don't use anybody else's stuff, and be separate from the world. Instead, what it's saying is, this is what everybody else is doing, so we're going to bring this in as well. For example, a popular front-end HTML and CSS framework is called Bootstrap. And Bootstrap was actually created by Twitter. And it was originally called Twitter Bootstrap, and now it's just called Bootstrap. And if you go to getbootstrap.com, you can see Bootstrap in its current form, and the newer versions are coming out. And that's a great framework. Well, MVC says, you know what? That's a great framework. So we're going to pull it in as a NuGet package. And so when you start up your MVC application, it's pulling all those NuGet packages in to build this completed template. So let's see the NuGet packages that are brought in for this template that's been created. So I right-click on References and say Manage NuGet Packages. In my Installed section, notice I have all of these different NuGet packages. There's a lot. For example, if you look, there is jQuery. Now, one of the things you gotta note is right off the bat, I have 17 updates to do. In fact, jQuery, the version brought in by a template is 1.10.2. But the latest stable version is 3.1.1. Now you may be like me, and when you see updates that need to be done, you want to just hit that update button. And in some cases, that's not a problem. But whenever you see a major version number change, that, for example, that 1 has changed to a 3 now, that's something to look into. There's been 2 major versions of jQuery since this 1.10.2. Since that's the case, there's probably breaking changes in there that I need to be aware of. And so what I would not recommend you do is I would not recommend that you come to Updates, select all packages, and just say Update. If you do that, you will create some problems in your MVC template right off the bat. Now, with that being said, I do think that you should update these packages. It's just you're going to need to figure out, can I do an update to the latest version? Or, for example, when it comes to, let's go back to jQuery, maybe I should go and move to the 1.12.4, which is in the same major version. So it's really up to you. Now, if you're starting off with a blank template like this, or a blank MVC application, you could try just updating everything. And depending on when you do the download, when you do the template, you'll have a different number of updates. You'll have different places to update them to. And so it may work for you, it may not work for me. It all depends on timing. But if you're starting off from scratch, hey, it's a great time to try it. The other thing to note is sometimes you'll have this box checked. Now, with this box checked, notice Bootstrap. Installed is 3.0. The version, the latest pre-release is 4.0.0 Alpha 6. Well, that's an alpha release. That's not really something you want to have in a production application. But maybe if you're trying things out or learning what the new 4.0 Bootstrap has in store for you, maybe you want to do that in a demo application, in which case you could check this box, include pre-release. But I would recommend for any application where you're going to be using this in a business environment or where it's going to go into production in some way, uncheck this box. Don't include pre-release. Notice now that Bootstrap says the latest version is 3.3.7. That's the latest stable. You can still do this drop down here and look at all the different versions and change versions. So if you had this pre-release checked, you could say, yes, I see Alpha 6, but I really want to do 3.3.7. So you could do that, but with this checked, and if you said just update all over here, it would update to the latest pre-release version. That's not necessarily a good thing. So by default, I would recommend unchecking that and then going from there. All right, so that's enough about NuGet and about the packages that are installed. There's quite a few. Let's look at our template. And let's take a minute to talk about what is ASP.NET and what is MVC. ASP.NET is the umbrella under which Microsoft puts all of their web-focused tools and applications. It used to stand for Active Server Pages, which was that web forms thing I showed you earlier. But now it's just kind of the umbrella under which everything lives. And so MVC is one of those things that lives under the umbrella. MVC stands for Model View Controller. So 3 different things: models, views, and controllers. And we'll look at all 3 of those soon. Notice the controllers folder, the models folder, and the views folder. So we'll look at those in a minute. But one of the benefits of MVC is that all of our code, which is written in C#, is compiled and run on the server. Meaning, when the end user views a website that has been built with MVC, all they get is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They don't get the C# code. So all of our business logic, if we put it in C#, the end user never has access to that, even though they use the end result. Now, one thing a lot of people get confused on or miss entirely is the fact that MVC is a UI-centric pattern, a user interface. It doesn't really talk about or worry about or cover the business logic or the data access or the other things that are kind of behind the scenes. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you will have seen how I try and push you to put as much logic into your class library as possible. And the reason for that is because you can take that same class library and attach it here to this MVC application and connect it up. And so you could take an application that used to be a WinForm application, a desktop application, take away the WinForm, add in ASP.NET MVC, and as long as the logic was in the class library for the business logic and the data access, there's very little work to be done in MVC to get the same result or a similar result, but now on the web. In fact, in my C# application course, where we built the tournament tracker application, we pushed everything possible into our class library with the intent of changing the user interface, which is a WinForm application. The intent is to change that into something else later down the road. And in fact, I'll be creating an add-on course to change that WinForm application to a WPF application, but I'll also be doing another add-on course that changes the WinForm application over to be an ASP.NET MVC application. And so we can do both of those things by just replacing the user interface, not the entire application. So let's start with an overview of what MVC really does, the M, the V, and the C. Now the heart of MVC is the controllers. This is kind of the backbone of MVC. What the controllers do is they link the views with the data. So the controller is controlling the application. Now in our case, when we start off with a blank template, we actually have one controller already built, the home controller. Now if you note, there's not a lot of code in here. And it's a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is because this really is just a sample to get you started. But the other reason is because the MVC framework uses some naming conventions to link things up and make things link together. So in this case, we have the index action result, the about method, which returns an action result, and the contact method, which returns an action result. Now, an action result is usually a view. Now, remember, models, views, and controllers. So this controller is saying, return this view. Now, it doesn't say which view to return. It just says, return view. Well, where does that view come from? Well, if you have a home controller, then it's going to look for the view in the views folder, under the home folder, and here it's going to say, okay, this is the index action. Well, there's the index view. So that's, we'll get into the view in a minute, but that's the convention that it uses, is it looks at home controller means under views, home folder, and then takes the method name and says that's the page name. That's called the action. And the result of the action result, is to display the view. In this case, it says just display the index.cs HTML page. So for the about method, it's going to say, when it says return view, it's going to return the about.cs HTML page. So this is what the home controller does, is it says, here's which view to display when you call this method. Now that's very, very simplistic, and yet it does have some power behind it, and we'll see that in a minute. But don't worry if you say that looks really too simple, because your methods here will probably have a little bit more code to them. Maybe not a lot, but a little bit more. So we see this index action. We've already kind of opened this page up, but let's open up the index.cs HTML page, the view, to see what's in this view. And we'll close out that suggestion for now. Now, if you're familiar, and you probably should be if you're going to do ASP.NET MVC, if you're familiar with HTML, that's all this is for the most part. Right here is HTML. We'll ignore this part right up here for just a minute. But this HTML is just HTML. I mean, if you want to change this to an H2 tag, you just type 2 instead, and there's an H2 instead of H1. You can change it back. Now, if you're familiar with how a page is laid out, you'll notice something here. We're missing HTML. Normally, a complete HTML page has a head and a body. And in the head, we have things like our CSS and some settings like the page title and other things. In the body, we have HTML like this. We also have our JavaScript references and other things. Well, we don't have that here. And the reason why is because a view is just a part of your overall page. We're going to cover where the rest of that stuff is in just a minute. But for now, just note that this is just a part of our page. So that's a view. Now, unfortunately, if you notice over here, the models folder is empty. Now, I really wish that the default, when a template gets created, I wish it had at least one method that uses a model. Unfortunately, we don't have that demo, but don't worry. I'm going to walk you through creating a new controller, new views, and using models to connect those views. So we'll get there. But for right now, just note that there are no models here, but a model is simply a class with properties. That's all it really is. In fact, let's create our model now just so you can see what it looks like. Add class. And we're going to call this the person model. Now let's follow the same convention that we're using here. Home controller, well, person model. So public class person model. And I'll type prop, string, first name, prop, string, last name, prop, int, age. Now, normally I wouldn't have a property called age that's an integer because age is a changing thing. So instead, probably have something like a date time with maybe birthday. And that way I could always know what the age is based upon where we are in the year. But in this case, I just wanted to have an integer, so let's call it age and be good to go with that. And let's add one more. Prop bool is alive. So this right here, this class, is a model. It has 4 properties in it. That's all it really does. We could do some default setting. So for example, we could say equals true, default to true for is alive. And we could even default the age to something if you wanted to, but we'll default it to 0, which is the default for an integer, but now it's at least set. And same thing with first and last name, but we'll leave those alone. So that is a model. And we'll use that in a little bit to create, when we create a new controller. But for now, let's leave it like it is and close it out. Now I had said that the view is missing stuff. There's stuff missing here. Now I'll show you where that is. So if you go into Views folder and you look in the shared folder here, there is an underscore layout.cs HTML. If we double click that, this looks like an actual HTML page. We have our head up here, we have our body here, we have some interesting things, but it says scripts. So at least we know that there's jQuery and Bootstrap scripts, but it's different. And I'll cover this in a minute, but for now, just note that's where the scripts go, the JavaScript scripts. So this is more like our page. Well, if you notice right down here, inside of the body, inside of a div called container body content, or the class container and body content, we have this @renderBody. Now what this does, and I'll explain the ats in a minute, but for right now, what this does right here is it takes our view, so index.cs HTML, it takes that HTML code and sticks it here. So if we want to go to the About page, it takes out the code for index from here, and it takes the code from About and puts it here. And that's how it changes from page to page. And so when we're creating a new controller with new views, all we're really doing is just saying replace this code right here, this little bit, with this bit of HTML that I wrote, whether it's little or big. For example, the About page, very little. Whereas the index page, it's a bit more. Doesn't matter. We just stick it here. Now, why is that helpful? Well, notice up here and you don't have to understand all the HTML what it's doing, and we'll see what it's doing. But for right now, just note this up here is navigation. Well, all of our navigation is rendered once. So it always looks the same no matter what page we're on. And that's kind of helpful. Down here, we have our footer with a copyright notice. And it says copyright datetime.now.year. So 2017 is the current year. 2017 my ASP.NET application. That's the copyright that goes on every single page. The scripts are on every single page. Up here we have styles on every single page. And so all that stuff doesn't have to be repeated from page to page to page, or from view to view to view. Instead, each view just takes its code and puts it into this right here. And so it takes it as a part and puts it into the whole. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we actually hit play and see how this website renders, the last thing I want to talk about is what's called the Razor syntax. R-A-Z-O-R. Razor. And the Razor syntax is Microsoft's creation that allows us to mix C# and HTML. And it's really quite brilliant. Notice everywhere we see this @ symbol right here. That @ symbol says, I am going to bring in some C# code. But notice how it's mixed right inside of our HTML. It's not a problem. The rendering engine is smart enough to know when C# stuff starts and when it ends. So for example, down here, we have @html.actionLink, and then it passes in 3 parameters. What this does is it creates a link on a page. But that link is based upon a path, a route. So it says the home controller, the index action. And it says we're going to have the actual text be home. Now, why is it important to have this method right here? Well, normally a link has the full path. So http://localhost:13.297, whatever it is, / all that stuff. We don't have any of that here. This method takes care of everything, including finding out what the link is, what the URL path should be, all the way to the home controller, the index action. It's kind of a nice little tool to have. Well, that's a C# method. But notice right here, we have our list item tag. And so it says list item, and then it has C# code right away. So it's HTML code or HTML markup, and then C# code. And then right back to HTML markup to close out the list item. And so the rendering engine says, no problem. I know how to do this. And so it knows based upon the brackets or the spaces or whatever else we do, it says, okay, I know this is a transitioning from C# back to HTML. Every once in a while, this gets a little confused. Don't worry, there's a way to get around that to tell the rendering engine this is where C# starts and ends, and that's with curly braces. But for the most part, this right in line works really well. And so down here, we have the copyright symbol, and then we say grab the C# datetime.now.year, and then it puts that value, which is 2017 for this current year, it puts that right in this spot and keeps going. Remember that the client never has access to this, not even in the code behind in the browser. Instead, all they see is 2017. So a big part of the MVC framework is using this Razor engine. Now notice on the index page, we skipped over this right here. There's those curly braces. And here, what it's doing is it's saying viewBag.title equals this. So it's actually saying, here's this property, assign it this value. And that's all C#. Notice a semicolon even. And so we have this at curly brace and then close curly brace. So the Razor engine knows that everything between these two curly braces is C# code only. Now the viewBag itself, this is a pet peeve of mine. The viewBag, I would recommend that you not use that often. Use it sparingly. Once people learn about the viewBag, they tend to think that it's for everything. And it really isn't. The viewBag should be used as little as possible. But what it is this grab bag. You can use it for anything you want. This .title property doesn't technically exist until we create it. So for example, I could say viewBag dot, notice the dot does not bring up any IntelliSense, dot superhero equals Tim, which is a little thinking too much of myself, but that's okay. So that works. It would compile and work because I've now added a new property to the viewBag. We can put any kind of object in this property we want because it's dynamic. Now in this case, Microsoft has said we want to use the viewBag.title. If we go back to layout.cs.html and scroll at top, notice here in the head we have the title tag, and that's the title for the web page. And it says at viewBag.title dash my ASP.NET application. So this page can change that title. And if we look, the About page also changes that title. So depending on which view you are going to, the title of the web page will change, even though we're not actually changing this right here, the actual layout.cs.html, because we are changing a bit of it with this viewBag.title. So if you want to use it for little stuff like that, that's great. Just don't stuff it full of tons of data. That makes your application bloated, and it slows down your web server, and it causes some problems. So just try and limit that to just little stuff. Okay, so as a quick overview, we've learned about what Razor is. We've learned that this right here is just a web part, a piece, and that piece gets put into this @renderBody, which is Razor, by the way. Just calling the renderBody method inside of C#. And so our actual web page is rendered off of layout.cs.html, and then which view we're looking at, index, contacts, about, or a different one we've created. So let's actually run this right now and just see how this web page looks. Now right now it says Google Chrome next to the play button. It may be different for you. In fact, if I do the drop down here, notice Chrome, Internet Explorer, Microsoft Edge, or even Windows Phone. I don't have Firefox installed currently, so I don't have Firefox in this list, but if I did, that browser would show up as well. And so since Google Chrome is my default browser, it gets chosen here, which I love Chrome, so we'll use that. The reason this choice is significant is because we can actually open different browsers to test out if they all look similar. And this is more of an issue going back a couple years than it is now, but there used to be major problems with rendering from Internet Explorer to Chrome to, Safari. And so the idea of having the ability to display your application on one or more browsers and try it out and switch very, very easily was a big deal. Now, it's still an issue, but it's not nearly the issue that it was. And you can also say, if you say browse with, and wait for it, there we go. We can actually select multiple and say browse. And if you do that, it will open, let's actually close that one, or not select that one. So it could say open Chrome, Internet Explorer, and Edge, and we'll actually open 3 different windows at the same time and show you the same exact website. For now though, we're just going to run Google Chrome. So I'll run this and get this page right here where it's saying, okay, your application is starting. Once it starts, here is our application. Now, again, remember this is Bootstrap, and if you're not familiar, Bootstrap is a responsive framework, meaning when I maximize this page, it laid out in 3 different columns down here, but if I were to shrink it down, notice those 3 columns are now 1 stacked column. And if I shrink it down even further, notice this menu bar up here, that changes to this little drop down here. That's just stuff that Bootstrap does, and it's really, really cool, and it does a lot of fun stuff. But for now, let's look at our page. Notice it says up here in the upper left, home page, because we are on the index page. Remember, index set the view bag. If we come back over here, the view bag.title to home page. So now let's go to the About page. Also notice the URL before you continue. The URL here is localhost 63.564. This right here is the port number, and that will change depending on your build because it will change where it's hosted. And so don't worry about that. That's just the IIS Express on your machine running in the background. A copy or a slimmed down copy of IIS, which is Microsoft's Internet Information Server, which is how they host web pages. And they have to have that running in order to actually view a web page. Now, if I look at the code behind for this, hit F12. All right, so here is our code behind. If I look at this 2017. So if I select that, notice it says copyright 2017, not datetime.now.year. I can't see that. I told you that, but I wanted to show you that. Okay, so you've seen that the URL right now is just localhost. But watch what happens when I click the About link. It now says /home/about. And this is the About page. Also notice up here it says About in my title bar. If I say Contact, it says /home/contact. Go back to Home, there's no /anything. And this is all about routing. So if I wanted a contact page and I knew that it was the home controller, so /home controller/contact page, and I hit enter, it takes me to the contact page. So this is the route to go to contact. We can avoid having people have to type those things in by creating these links. Notice that link is one of those action links created by the Razor engine based upon the controller and the action. Now we'll get into how those routes are set up in just a minute. But for now, I want to go back and look at this page right here. Now let's make this half the size of the screen, and we'll select the Visual Studio as the other half. Let's take this out. Now if I come over here to my index.cs HTML page, which is the view, I can start making some modifications, even though I'm currently running. I can make modifications to my HTML, not my C#, but my HTML. So for example, this ASP.NET and right up here, I want to change that to say demo on YouTube. And I save that, nothing happens. But wait, there's this little refresh link here. If I click that, notice it's already refreshing the Chrome browser. And it says demo on YouTube. Now I could have come over here and hit refresh over here. So why is it important to have this little link here? Well, right now we only have one browser linked. Notice a little tooltip there. But what if I opened this in Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, and Edge? Do you think I want to hit refresh on 4 different browsers? Instead, I just hit this little refresh right here, and we'll refresh every linked browser. You can also do the drop down here and see which browsers there are by going to the browser link dashboard, or you can see the actual command Control plus Alt plus Enter to refresh the linked browsers. Next, let's look at closing this out and see where these routes take us. So the routing happens in this app_start folder. We have BundleConfig, FilterConfig, and RouteConfig. Let's go to RouteConfig. We'll come back to BundleConfig in a bit. So the RouteConfig is where the MVC application figures out how it navigates between controllers and actions. And so right here we see, and we can ignore this. This is the default to ignore this route. Don't worry about it. But down here we have routes.mapRoute. And this is the default route. And so it says controller/action/ID. So what that's saying is after that localhost : and the port number, the next thing it's going to look for, the next thing is going to be the controller. The next thing is going to be the action. And the thing after that is the ID. So remember that the about page was /home, that's the controller, /about, that's the action. It didn't have a /ID. And the home page, the starting page, didn't have anything. Well, if we look down here, we have defaults. It says the controller, that's this right here, the default is home. For the action, the default is index. Now remember that the home page is in the home controller and it's the index action. And the ID is URL parameter.optional, meaning we don't have to have it. So if we don't specify an action, it's going to assume the index action. If we don't specify a controller, it's going to assume the home controller. Now, we can't say localhost/about because it wouldn't know what the controller is. So we still have to specify the controller if we're going to specify the action. But if we say localhost/home, it's going to say, okay, no problem. I will go to the index action. And if we say just localhost, and I am assuming you put the port number on there. If we say just localhost, then it's going to go to /home/index as its assumption. It's not going to change the URL. It's just going to assume those two values, home and index. It'll also assume there is no ID since that's optional. So the question becomes, why do you care? And the answer is simple. For the most part, you shouldn't. Okay? Again, my piece of advice, my best practice would be that you just leave this register routes method entirely alone. However, there are times when you may want to add a route, add a new way of doing routing. For example, Web API, which remember I said before I love Web API, they have the same idea of controllers in Web API, and actions too. But they don't want to get confused with MVC, because remember those two live kind of together. Whenever you get Web API, you get MVC as well. And so what they do is they add new mapping and they put it above this mapping. And the reason they put it above is because these routes get looked at in this order. So it says, does it match this? If yes, do it. If it doesn't, does it match this? If yes, then do it. And so for a Web API, they say API slash. And I don't think they have the ID here. But so what they do is they say, if you see API in what would be the controller spot, it's not a controller called API. It goes then to the Web API processor. And then the next thing is you look for controller, action, and ID. Well, you name something else called maybe Web API. And that's the Web API route. And so when we get a URL, it's going to come in here and say, okay, what are the routes we have? The first route is the Web API route. After localhost, does it say API? If so, this is the route handler. However, if it doesn't say API, then it goes down here and says, well, whatever's after localhost must be the controller. And so that's how we can have multiple routes to do different things. Again, I wouldn't typically think that you would need this. I've used it a couple times for very, very specific circumstances, but for the most part, I don't even touch this file. I leave it alone. I do think, however, that it's important to at least know how this routing works, because MVC, if you're not careful, can feel an awful lot like magic happens. And the problem, I really, really hate magic when it comes to programming. And you've probably heard this before, but whenever you have magic in programming, where you say it just works, the problem is when it stops working, you don't know why. And so that's why I try and cover these things that may be a little off the beaten path, but I really think you should know, because if something breaks in the routing, you know where to go. app_start, RouteConfig.cs. Now there's one more thing I want to cover before we start modifying this site in earnest, and that is the bundling. So let's close all but this. So we have the layout.cs HTML, which that's under the shared folder under views. It's a views shared folder _layout.cs HTML. And this is our standard page. This is the full page, remember, and this is where our part goes, our view. Now, remember I said before that I want to go over what this scripts.render is. But for now, just to think about it as that's where our scripts are. Well, let's cover what this is. This is called bundling. And so instead of having a script tag here, and a script tag would look something like this, where you'd say script src equals, you'd have a path, so maybe scripts/bootstrap.js, something like that. Oops, let's not. There you go. And we need an end tag, sorry. There we go. So that would be what a standard script tag would look like. So we'd have our path to /script/bootstrap.js. And that's, by the way, right here. Notice this tilde here. The tilde means from the root of our web application. In this case, our root is that localhost : the port. So from there, it's /scripts/bootstrap.js. So that's a typical script, but we don't have those here. Instead, we have this @ which indicates the Razor framework, scripts.render, which is a C# method. Then it has that same tilde, so it means from the root of our website, so localhost : the port, /bundles/jQuery. Well, if you look, let's kind of collapse these all down. I don't see a bundles folder. Again, root, where's the bundles folder? It's looking for it, and somehow it works. So where is it? Well, it's actually part of our app_start folder. We have BundleConfig. Let's open that up. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a caveat here. This is Microsoft's original way of doing bundling. And what bundling is grouping together scripts into one group, essentially. That's kind of redundant. But there are better ways out there in the open source community that work better. For example, Webpack is one way of doing it. And so there's other ways of doing this, but Microsoft has kind of kept with this bundling for now. My guess is that bundling is on the way out, and that at some point we'll see them use, again, some industry standard ways of grouping these scripts together. So I wouldn't go head over heels with bundling, but at the same time, you don't have to avoid them either. So what bundling is in this register bundles method, we can add one or more bundles and name them. So for example, this first one right here, bundles.add, it's a method, new script bundle. Notice there's script bundle and there's style bundle. We'll come to style in a minute, but that's just CSS. So script bundle says, okay, here is the name. In this case, the name is from the root, localhost : the port number, /bundle/jQuery, which sounds familiar because over here, render bundles/jQuery. So that's the bundle name, and it says include, and here's the scripts we're going to put in this bundle. In this case, there's one script. And that script is starting from the root /scripts, well, that's this folder right here, /jQuery- and then these curly braces version. Well, notice jQuery- 1.10.2.js. So it's saying include the jQuery, whichever version we have included here. Now you can probably see the benefits of doing this right now, because this version here allows us to say we don't really care which version of jQuery we have. Whatever version it is, bring that one in. So if we change to jQuery 3.2.1, I believe it was, the latest jQuery, it would replace this 1.10.2 with a 3.2.1 version, and we wouldn't have to do anything else with our application because we'd still bring in that same bundle, and that bundle would have the newest version of jQuery. So that's kind of nice. But this bundle is a little bit lame in the fact that it only brings in one script. That's it. Whereas down here, the Bootstrap bundle brings in bootstrap.js and respond.js. That's a little better. Now, the reason we have multiple bundles is because ordering is important when it comes to JavaScript. And so you have to, for example, load jQuery before you load jQuery.validate. because jQuery.validate relies on jQuery. So the short version of this is that Microsoft has created some bundles and they've put in the right spots, so jQuery and then Bootstrap. They put in the right spots for when they're needed. There's Modernizer. And if you wanted to add your own bundle, just basically copy what they're doing and then put your own values in. Here's the name, and then here's what to include. And if you want to include more than one thing, just say comma and the next thing. And if you want, the same thing happens with CSS. They only have one style bundle, but they call it content/CSS. And so they have the bootstrap.css, which is pretty important, but then also your site.css. The thing I like here is under content, that site.css, there's not much in here. What that's meant for, though, is meant for you to put your own custom CSS. And so they already put a placeholder there and said, okay, put your own CSS there. That's great. And they'll go ahead and render that for you. Now, I kind of wish they had the same thing for JavaScript, and they don't. And so if you want to add that, you might want to put that in this Bootstrap bundle here, or you might want to create your own bundle and then just add it afterwards here. So it's really up to you. Now, I said that's the final thing, but I want to cover one more thing real quick, just briefly, and then we'll come back to it because it's on the screen and I don't want you to say, hey, I'm skipping over something. At RenderSection. This is a fun one. And so what this at RenderSection does, it says sometimes you might want to put stuff in more than one location. No worries. We'll create this at RenderSection. And you can create as many as you want and put in different places in this layout.cs HTML page. And what it allows you to do is later put stuff here. Or if you had one of these up here, put stuff in the menu. If you wanted to, you could create lots of little widgets and have them all over the place and have each different page or each different view update what's in that little widget. But in this case, Microsoft includes one by default, and it's not required. So it requires false. But what it is at RenderSection called scripts. So it says, okay, I will put code right here. And notice it's right before the close of the body tag. Now this is where you put any custom JavaScript. So let's say for a minute that your index page, let's go back over there to index. So under views, the home index page. So if this page wanted to have to mess with JavaScript, maybe it wants to do something where it changes the color of this H1 tag, let's just say. And it wanted to use jQuery to do it, because jQuery is a nice, easy way of accessing items. Well, if we put our script right down here, it says script type equals text.javascript, and then put our access to jQuery, whatever we're going to do. And, let's just pretend that's JavaScript. So if we put that here, where does this script tag end up? Well, it ends up right here. Why is that a problem? Well, remember that JavaScript is order dependent. Guess where jQuery is? Down here. So we're having a script up here that calls jQuery, but jQuery is not loaded yet. It's down here. That's a problem. Instead, what we'd do is we'd actually cut this out here. Let's start over. We'd actually do a render section. So we'd say at section, all lowercase, and then we'd say this section is the scripts section. And here I could paste my JavaScript, my script tag. And so now, since it says section scripts, which we defined over here, scripts, RenderSection, and so it says, okay, on the index page, I have this little bit of code right here. It's not going to go here. That code goes in the render section called scripts, right down here. Well, guess what? This is below jQuery. Now, this script has access to the $sign and all the rest that jQuery provides. Fun stuff. So that render section, pretty powerful stuff. Mostly I use it for just those scripts. But even that's a pretty limited operation because, and I haven't really covered this because I haven't really covered HTML, CSS, and JavaScript yet on this channel, but you really shouldn't have JavaScript right on your HTML page. It's just not a great idea. For the most part, you should have JavaScript in their own files, and you should access them as needed. But you kind of want to separate those two a bit. Now, there's a little bit of debate there, but for the most part, that's the case. It used to be we'd put JavaScript right on this page and just put a whole bunch of JavaScript there. The problem is no code reuse, and it gets kind of messy, and there's some other things that come along with that. And so I'd recommend you create your own .js file and access it from here if you need to. And so there might be a few calls here, but for the most part, all your JavaScript is located in its own file. So there probably won't be a ton of JavaScript here, maybe just a few calls or a few calls out to a few methods you've created. But there may be a little bit of JavaScript here, and so this is kind of important to know. So that's the render section. All right, so we've done enough explaining and going over and covering, enough theory essentially. Let's go ahead and actually create a new controller and use our model we created and create some views. So to do that, let's shrink these down for a bit. Let's go to our controllers and say, you know what? I want to have a person controller. So I right-click on controllers, say add. Notice the top option is controller. Well, that's what we want. Now, really a controller, if we open up home controller, it really is just a class, but inherits from controller. So there is a little bit there. It also has this public action result and all the rest. So there's a little bit of structure there we could create. So usually I use this add controller instead of add class, just because it makes it a little bit easier. So let's just do add controller. And I'm going to say leave this alone, the MVC5 controller empty. Now there's a whole bunch of fun little templates here that you could use where maybe you want to have a controller with read-write actions. If you want to play with that or play around with that, you can. It creates quite a bit of stuff. So create action, the read action, the update action, delete action, and the list action. That's a lot of stuff. All right. And if you want to use MVC Framework, which again, I'm not a big fan of, but you could do, stay away from that stuff. For the most part, stick with your empty controller. Now, when I hit add, it brings up this dialog box here. Notice I haven't touched anything. Notice how default is highlighted and controller is not. And this is just a help for you. It's trying to tell you, hey, you need to name your controller something with controller at the end. In this case, let's call it the people controller. I hit add, and it's going to scaffold out a controller for me, which really means it just creates the class name, inherits some controller, and it creates my index method, which is nice because remember that the default for a route is to call the index action. So if I say localhost :the port /people. It's going to go to the people controller, and since I have not specified an action, it will go to the index action. Now what happens if the index action isn't there? Bad things. So it's kind of nice to have this index method already here, so we already have this action. Now, notice down in my views folder, I now have a people folder. It's empty, but there's a people folder there. That's part of what MVC does when you use that controller. Now I have this index action, which returns a view. Kind of cool, but now I've got to create the matching cs.html file for my view. Well, don't worry, there's actually a shortcut to doing that. If I right-click on my method name, notice the first two options are go to view, well there isn't one, or add view. And that's the one you want, add view. Now it says, okay, what's the view name? Well, it's the index view because it's the index action. And so it puts that there. You could change it, don't change it. Now, the next thing it says is, what template do you want to use? This template is the empty template, meaning without a model. Or do you want to use one of these other templates? The create, the delete, the details, the edit, the empty, the list. We'll cover a couple of these in a minute, but for now, let's create the empty without model template. Create a partial view, that's unchecked. We're not going to cover partial views in this video. It's getting long enough as it is, but that's an option. Leave it blank for now until you know what you're doing. Now, you use a layout page. By default, this is checked, which is good. We're going to use that _ layout.cshtml file because that's where all the other stuff is as far as the head goes and the body and the script tags and the CSS and all the rest. And it says leave empty is set as a razor _ view start file, which is this file here. So yeah, leave it empty. But that does mean you can change your layout to a different layout. Maybe you have 2 or 3 different layouts. For example, you might have a layout for employees and a different layout for guests. And so you have the same views, but maybe they have different menu options or menus, or maybe they have different color schemes. Whatever you want to have, it would be a different layout page would work for that. So we're going to hit add. Now notice under people, we now have index.cshtml. By default, it adds that viewbag.title and says index. Let's go ahead and change that to be people. So for the index page, we'll say the viewbag is going to say people. And then this is the default people view. Just so you know what it's going to look like. Now if we hit run, let's wait for this to load. So your application's starting. Once it starts, we're going to see how to access this page. Now notice since it's on this index.cshtml page, when I ran it, it says, you know what? You probably want to go to that page, therefore I'll take you there. See, /people/index. Let's come back here for a minute. And now we're at the home page because that's the default route. And if we were to do /home, it's still here because remember, if we don't specify a controller, then the controller default is home. If we don't specify an action, the action default is index. Therefore, since we're not specifying the action, it's saying the action is index. Well, that's still this page because this page is home/index. But if we instead say /people, there's our default people view, even though we have not specified /index, because the default page or default action is index action. Also notice up here, it says people, and there's our h2 tag we specified there. Pretty basic stuff right now. We've created one method, which was already kind of there. We created a view for it, and we said load that view just by navigating to it manually. Well, let's create a new action. So public action result, and let's call this list people. Now, let's start with just return view. But you know what? Let's actually create a list of people. List of person. If I can type, I'll do control dot to find that person. It's not finding it. Let's find out why. It's person model. That's why. Person model. Now I do control dot and add the using statement for MVC demo.models. And we'll call this people equals new list of person. And we'll say people.add new person model. We'll say first name equals Tim, last name equals Corey, age equals 38, and is alive equals true. We don't even need to specify that because that defaults to true. All right, so there's one person added to our list. Let's copy it a couple more times. We'll say Joe Smith, whose age is 56. And we'll add Sarah Connor. And we're never quite sure what her age is because it always changes. So those are the three people we're going to add to our list. Now, this is our model, this person model. And now this is actually our data. Say we got this from a database. Maybe asked our class library, give me all the people in the people table in our SQL database. That's what this is simulating, something like that. Now, obviously, you wouldn't have just dummy data like this, but let's pretend like we're doing that. So now, how do I get this list to the view? Well, that's actually pretty simple. Like that. So return the view and pass in any object, any kind of a string, if you want a model or a list of model, it doesn't really matter. Now, I recommend only a model or a list of model. Now, don't forget, we're not done yet. We need to create the view. So I right-click on List People, say Add View. The view name, List People. The template, I want this to be a list. What's the model class? That would be the person model. So the individual model is the person model, but it's a list of them. Now, this is the really cool thing, is that built right in, it understands how to deal with this data. The model class, it just looks for any kind of class that's not a controller. It looks for any kind of class that says, okay, that could be a model. In this case, the person model. Now, just as a quick note, in older versions of Visual Studio, it used to be that your model might not show up in this list if you had not yet compiled. Now, I believe it's been changed since then. I haven't had a problem recently with it. But if your model is not in the list, what you need to do is exit out of here, go to the build menu, and say build the project. Or just hit the green play button and then close it out once it opens up. Either way, you need to compile your application. But I believe in 2017 that's taken care of for you. But just so you know, in case you're using an older version of Visual Studio, or in case that doesn't show up for you for some reason. So we've got the model selected. It's a list template. And I wouldn't have to use this template if I don't want. I could just use an empty template. But I kind of like to use the list template because it gives me a structure to work from, a starting point that I can then edit how I want. Everything else stays the same. We hit add. Now there's a lot more stuff going on here than in our index. So index, that was it. Now we have this. So let's look at what this is really doing. The first change is this @model at the very top. And it says IEnumerable MVCDemo.models.personModel. And that's our list of model. But instead of list, it's IEnumerable. And that's okay to have IEnumerable instead of list. Next, we have this H2, it says list of people. That has a paragraph tag with an action link for creating a new person. Now notice this has 2 values instead of 3, like before. Previously you saw in ActionLinks we had both the controller and the action. But in this overload, it's the name and it's the actual action, but no controller because it assumes the person controller or the people controller. Now that's going to create a link going to nowhere. We don't have a create action yet, but we'll leave it alone for now. Then it creates a table. And this is the reason why I like doing it this way with the template, because it shows us kind of how to do this whole layout with lists. So it starts off with display name for model, and then this arrow, this kind of the link arrow, model.firstName. So what this display name for says is give me the display name for first name, which in our case just says first name, and then last name and age and is alive. And then we have an @for each. Now again, you gotta catch this. This is C# code. Remember, it's Razor, so it's C#, a for each. So saying for each item in model. So that's gonna say for each person, essentially. And it has the open curly braces. But we're mixing in HTML. So notice even though we've got a for each, which really is a C# construct and has the open closing curly braces, we can still mix in our HTML, which is cool because we're now allowed to do things like this where we're saying for each person, create a new row in the table. And then do display for their first name, last name, age, and is alive. Notice the difference here for display for. Display name for and display for. Depending on, this is for the name of this column, this is for the value. And depending on the type, it's going to change how we render the HTML for this particular item. In this case, age versus is alive. And we'll see that in a minute. And then finally we have this down here, 3 action links. Again, the 3 locations you don't have yet, 3 actions you don't have yet. The edit action, the details action, and the delete action. We'll come back to that in a minute, but just note that this template kind of thinks that we're going to create a full application, a full CRUD application, create, read, update, and delete. And so it says, okay, I'm going to show you all the people, but now you should probably have an ability to create a new person, and you should probably be able to edit an existing person, and you should probably be able to see details on an existing person, and you should probably be able to delete that person. So that's kind of their concept of how this would work, and so it's really built for that full CRUD operation. If you don't want to do full CRUD, no problem. Just take this out. But for now, let's actually run this. So I'll say run. I'll wait for it to build. It's loading. It takes a bit for MVC to get started the first time. But isn't this cool? This is, since again, we're in the CS HTML file, it said, okay, you probably want to go right there. And so it takes me to this page right here. Notice, and that's why I created a bool especially, is alive. Those are checkboxes. It's not like this is a text box that says true or false. It says Boolean, it's only two values, true or false. That's what a checkbox is, true or false. Therefore, when we say display for is alive, it's going to render that as a checkbox. So we have Tim, Corey, age 38, and is alive is true. In fact, all these are is alive. So this shows us how to use a model and a list of model. Now, we could wire up these other ones. We won't, but for now, just note that this is a pretty powerful templating engine. It gives you all the examples you need. Because you probably won't remember display for versus display name for. No problem. Just use the template and then say, okay, from here I want to do something different. We don't have to use a table. We could strip this down and say, you know what? Forget the titles, forget all this. Instead, we're just going to list out, do a for each and list out each person's first name. We could do that, and that would work. And so there's a lot of things you can do here from this point. And it's a whole lot easier to start from here than it is to start from that blank page and go, how do I loop through again? How do I display the value for in a way that creates the right type of input element? All those kind of things. This just makes it a whole lot easier to start from this and then modify going forward. All right, now if I were to actually click on one of these links here, I get this. It's a 404. And a 404 is an error that's kind of a big bad. It's one of those things where if you run into this error, it means that you've kind of wandered off a path and there's a problem. You definitely don't want to have 404 errors in your application. So make sure that you either change those to take them out or actually add those actions in. Now I want to show you something else as well, and that's the idea of creating errors or having errors in your application. So let's go back over to the people controller, and I'm going to create intentionally an error. So let's say person model p equals new person model. Now I'm going to say int I equals p.age. Let's actually flip this around. So let's say 5 divided by age. Now what's the age right now? Well, age is defaulting to 0. So 5 divided by 0, well, that's a divide by 0 error. What's going to happen? Well, let's run and find out. So we're going to run Chrome. We're going to show you what an error looks like. Let's wait for it to load. All right. So now let's go to the people controller. Remember, the index action is a default, so I don't need to specify index. I get this error. Now I'm debugging, so let's simulate the idea that we're not actually debugging, and so we wouldn't have caught this in our code. Before we do that, I just want to point out that the new exception box is a whole lot more intuitive now. It's kind of trimmed out all that stuff that you probably didn't need anyways. and it really comes down to attempted to divide by 0. You still have the details, so if you want to open that up, you can. You can still copy the details, you can look at the exception settings, all that fun stuff. But let's instead hit continue. This is the yellow screen of death. It's what you'll see on your website if you have an exception. Now, here's the problem. You don't want to show this to your customer, your end user. And the reason why not is because look at this. Source error. Line 16, int I equals 5 divided by p.h. And by the way, here is the stack trace. So you have all the information you need to understand how this application works, including the controller it's in, the line it is, here's the code surrounding that line, and here is the complete stack trace. So that's sensitive information. Remember I said before that the end user only gets HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Well, we've now violated that. We've shown them C# code. Well, there's a way to solve this. If we go to the Web.Config, now if you're familiar with the WinForms or WPF, there's the App.Config. These two are functionally equivalent. It's just that on the web, we have Web.Config. For applications like desktop applications, we have App.Config. So Web.Config, it's got a little more stuff in it than we're used to probably. But right here under system.web, we need to add a new tag. So in here, we say custom, notice the IntelliSense, so we can just use that. Errors. Mode equals, we have 3 options. Off, on, and remote only. And so what this is saying is we're turning custom errors either on or off or only for remote. What are custom errors? Well, whenever we would normally have that yellow screen of death where we have the C# code, instead, if custom errors are on, we'll display a friendly error message page. Or if custom errors are remote only, if anyone not on the web server itself gets the error, they'll go to the friendly page. But if you're on the web server, you'll get the yellow screen of death. Or again, off would be we're not using custom errors, show that yellow screen of death. This is what I use typically. Remote only. And the reason why is because for my end users, I don't want them to see the error. But I want to see the error because I want that valuable debugging information. Now, we're currently on the server, so instead let's just show it as on for custom error because that way we'll only ever get custom errors. So let's run this again. We're going to run that exact same problem by doing a /people, and we'll see what our error page looks like now. Okay, so we have that same error. We continue. And now we have this nice, generic, very, very simple web page that says error. An error is occurred while processing your request. It's ugly, but it's a whole lot prettier for the end user than the showing the source code is, or a stack trace. And it's also, it protects our site. Where does this page come from? Well, if we come back over here to the shared folder, error.cshtml. Error, an error is occurred while processing your request. So there you go. You can change this page to be something fun. You can change this page to be something lighthearted or more informative. Or you can actually have multiple of these error pages depending on what type of error you got. a 404 or 500 or a 401 or a 403. Doesn't really matter. You can send it to different pages based on that. But for now, the simplest thing to do is just add this custom errors mode equals on or remote only, and then modify this error.cshtml file. And now you're not showing users that ugly error screen. Okay, there's a couple things I have not yet shared that I want to go over before we're done. The first one is this Global.asax file. This is where your application really starts, the application _ start. Now, we haven't really covered areas, but we really won't in this video. But those are registered in the areas there. We don't have any areas right now. But now here we have filter config. And remember, we skipped the filters because we don't really use filters either. But then we have routes, register routes, and there's our routes. Register bundles, and there's our bundles. So that's where the bundles and the routes are registered. So if you were to do this, well, now you don't have any bundles. And so that would be a problem. And that's where you come to fix it, is in Global.asax. Again, you probably shouldn't change this file, but that's where this is. If you want to register something else, for example, a global logging system, probably here is the right spot. So that's this file right here. And then also we have the view _view start. So we have this views folder, and inside views, let's collapse the other ones. Inside views, we have this view start.cshtml. Inside here, it specifies the default layout, which in our case is _layout. So again, not really magic. This is where we specify that this _layout.cshtml is our default layout. We could change that if you wanted to. You could change it to _ your company name default layout.cshtml. That's fine. And then just change this file here as well. So those two things I thought were important to at least show you so you have an idea that they're there. But it's probably not something you need to modify. Other files are the Packages.config. This is where all of our NuGet packages are specified. You don't touch this really. Usually you use the editor under references, right click and say manage NuGet packages. So leave that one alone. Now, when it comes to actually deploying an MVC website, it's a little more complicated than deploying an actual website. An MVC website is actually compiled. The nice thing is, if you right click on the project and say publish, it has some options there as far as Azure IIS or FTP, or publish into a folder, and you can set all that up. So just note that. Also, and this is just a .NET thing in general, but if you were to check this into source code control, so for example, Git would probably be the source control you'd use. One of the things you'll make sure, again, this is a .NET thing in general, but I'll specify it here. This packages folder does not get checked into source control. Okay, neither is this hidden .vs file or folder. You'd only check in the SLN and everything in here, or most everything in this MVC demo folder. The reason you do not check in packages, there's a ton of them here. These are all of our NuGet packages. We get those when we build the application or when we ask for them. Instead, what you check in is this Packages.config file. This specifies the packages we need. So it does not find them when it goes to build. It will say, okay, go and NuGet and get these. So that's just a kind of a little tip there when it comes to Git. I'll have a video series on Git coming up shortly, but that's kind of important to note if you're checking that into source control. Okay, so that's MVC. We created a new controller called the People Controller. We added 2 actions to it. We created those two matching views. We actually used our model, and we've really covered everything in here as far as the base demo goes. From here, you can really create pretty impressive websites by just putting different pieces together. Now, I haven't covered what HTML is, what CSS is, or what JavaScript is, and that's not really in the purview of this video. So if you're not really comfortable with those yet, I'd say probably hold off on trying to build web applications. Because even though a lot of this is C#, there is still an awful lot that's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So it'd be important to learn those or get a pretty good foundation in those before you move on. Now, upcoming on this channel, you will see some content on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you'll get some of that content in the near future. But for now, if you're not comfortable with those three, you might want to learn those before trying to tackle a web project like this. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I'd love to know what your questions are or what things you struggle with, what things you like and don't like about MVC. So make sure to let me know in the comments down below. I try and respond to everyone if possible. Also, don't forget to jump on the mailing list so you get alerted about new events and new discounts that I provide, as well as new content. And if you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you would give me a thumbs up down below as well.